This is the KLM Flight 4805, and this is the Pan Am Flight 1736. Both Airbuses are carrying over 500 passengers altogether, both controlled by experienced captains and perfect for travel. But there's one small problem. You see, they're both large aircrafts, and they have to be in one of the smallest airports around. And a small airport means a small runway, and the Tenerife Los Rodeos runway was just that, and also particularly busy. Now this is where things get a little intense. Both aircrafts want to take off at the same time, so one of them has to wait for the other, right? Well, not in this story. This is where things take a pretty dark turn. After a few moments, the Pan Am flight began to backtrack so it could speed up the runway and take off. On the other hand, the KLM decided to speed up the same runway for a takeoff as well. Unknown to the crew, pilots, and passengers of both planes, they were about to make history as the worst accident in aviation history, sending shockwaves throughout the entire world. This was the beginning of the end, and no one had a single idea before it happened. But how come? First, a history lesson to put things into perspective. Despite being situated within the African continent, the Canary Islands have been integral to the Spanish kingdom since the early 15th century when the Spaniards conquered the archipelago. Even with the collapse of the Spanish colonial empire, the status of these small islands remained unchanged. In the late 1960s, a pro-independence armed movement emerged, challenging Spanish authority over the islands. The Mayak movement, advocating for the independence and self-determination of the Canary Archipelago and based in Algeria, spearheaded an aggressive campaign for autonomy. On Sunday, March 27, 1977, Mayak fighters orchestrated a significant event by planting an explosive device at Gran Canaria Airport in Las Palmas. The bomb detonated at 13:15 military time, resulting in injuries to 8 individuals, prompting immediate action from local authorities. Shortly after the explosion, a purported Mayak member claimed responsibility for another bomb threat, leading to the closure of the airport. Consequently, air traffic control faced a crisis, disrupting flights above the Canary Islands. As Gran Canaria Airport served as the primary hub for airliners transporting tourists to the archipelago from around the globe, the closure necessitated the diversion of flights to Los Rodeos Airport on the nearby island of Tenerife. Despite its smaller size compared to Gran Canaria, Los Rodeos was the nearest viable option for diverting incoming flights, facilitating the safe landing of dozens of planes, including 5 large airliners. Los Rodeos Airport became the only logical choice to divert every aircraft that was supposed to land in the Gran Canaria, but sadly, that day would morph into one of the saddest days in history. Aircrafts began landing and taking off in the Los Rodeos airport as scheduled, but there was a small problem. This airport was significantly smaller, and so planes had to do a lot more maneuvers and pay closer attention to air traffic control regarding instructions on where and how to park. Of all these aircrafts, there were 5 Boeing Airbuses, and 2 of these 5 are the reason why this story got so tragic. Arriving from Amsterdam at 3:36, KLM Flight 4805, and at 3:39, Pan Am Flight 1736 from Los Angeles via New York. Both aircrafts got rerouted like every other and had to face the challenges of the small Los Rodeos airport, which was ill-equipped for such large planes. Despite the airport's limitations, there were no better alternatives given the circumstances. With a small apron unable to accommodate all diverted aircraft, most had to park on the taxiway, leading to runway usage for both taxiing and takeoff. Coordination among air traffic controllers became crucial, with tensions high among all involved, from controllers to cockpit crews and anxious passengers. The situation worsened with descending fog, further complicating matters. But here's the crazy part. The captain of Pan Am Flight 1736 initially preferred to stay airborne. He never even wanted to land at Los Rodeos in the first place. He was perfectly content hovering above the Gran Canaria Airport, which was closed due to the bombing nearby, and hoping it will open up again soon. However, he was ultimately compelled to land at Tenerife Airport after 13 hours in the air. His name was Captain Victor Grubbs, and he felt for his passengers, who were all eager to depart. They were mostly seniors, and they had to sit in one spot at the Tenerife Airport while they awaited the opening of the Gran Canaria. So naturally, when news arrived that Gran Canaria Airport had reopened, Captain Grubbs prepared for takeoff. But unknown to him, there was a big problem: the presence of KLM Flight 4805. The KLM was still on the runway and was obstructing his path, leaving him with no choice but to wait for said plane to take off first so he could be cleared. On the KLM, however, at 16:56 military time, Captain Jacob Felthus and First Officer Van Zanten sought clearance from the control tower to taxi. So, the controller instructed KLM to backtrack to the end of the runway for takeoff. Meanwhile, at the same time, Pan Am 1736, who couldn't even see the KLM due to heavy fog covering the runway, requested permission to taxi down the runway. The control knew this would be disastrous and so instructed him to exit at the third taxiway rather than the one he was on. If he did it that way, he would be able to make room for KLM's departure. However, this decision posed challenges for Pan Am's captain. It required a complex maneuver to navigate the large aircraft through a tight turn. It was not impossible for someone with his experience, but he was exhausted and tired and just needed to be back in the air and get his passengers to their destination. On the other KLM 4805 aircraft, they were positioned for takeoff, and First Officer Klaus Muir's indicated readiness and awaited clearance. But this is where things got a little twisted. The control tower instructed him to stand by. The control tower said,
"Stand by. I will call you."
But somehow, Captain Van Zanten believed they received clearance. Tragically, the fatal misunderstanding would have devastating consequences. So why would he misunderstand such a clear message, you ask? Well, the primary reason for the failure of the KLM 4805 crew to receive crucial messages was because of the shared radio frequency used by all planes at the airport to communicate with the control tower, resulting in signal interference. Among these transmissions was Pan Am 1736's message indicating their continued taxi down the runway, which the Dutch crew of KLM 4805 failed to register. Believing the runway had to be clear, Captain Van Zanten initiated takeoff, unaware that Pan Am 1736 was still on the runway due to a thick fog obstructing visibility. Captain Grubbs, piloting Pan Am 1736, missed the third taxiway exit in the dense fog, prompting the controller to urge him to report upon vacating the runway as KLM 4805 awaited clearance for takeoff. However, the control tower personnel were unaware of the unfolding situation. Ground radars were unable to locate planes on the runway, and the dense fog obscured visibility, making it impossible to ascertain the positions of the aircraft. Consequently, they erroneously believed KLM 4805 was in position, leading to the inadvertent absence of clearance given to Captain Van Zanten. Captain Grubbs remained unaware of KLM's takeoff until he spotted the Dutch plane's landing lights hurtling toward them at full speed. His realization prompted an exclamation of shock.
"God damn, that son of a bitch is coming."
Captain Van Zanten applied a full throttle and executed a sharp left turn in an attempt to veer off the runway. He likely shared the surprise of witnessing Pan Am on the same path. Realizing he was hurtling too fast to halt, he endeavored to lift his aircraft over the one ahead. However, the proximity between the planes rendered this maneuver futile. The collision between KLM and Pan Am resulted in the rupture of Pan Am's fuselage above the wing and behind the cockpit, igniting a fierce fire fueled by spilled jet fuel. KLM, fully refueled before takeoff, erupted into flames upon impact, exacerbating the catastrophe. Meanwhile, within the control tower, controllers were startled by a series of thunderous explosions, yet the dense fog obscured their understanding of the unfolding tragedy. Nevertheless, emergency responders swiftly mobilized, spurred by the urgency of the situation. Shortly after the collision, an airport worker rushed to report a blazing aircraft on the runway. Despite the limited visibility, the fire crew sprang into action, only to encounter the blazing wreckage of KLM's aircraft along the runway. As the fog gradually lifted, firefighters noticed another intense glow further down the runway, signaling yet another inferno. Swiftly redirecting their efforts, they concentrated on extinguishing flames engulfing the Pan Am aircraft. The ferocity of the fire engulfing KLM's wreckage indicated beyond any doubt that rescue attempts were futile. Tragically, both aircraft were reduced to irreparable conditions by the relentless flames. The catastrophic blaze claimed the lives of all 234 passengers and 14 crew members aboard the KLM aircraft, marking a devastating loss that reverberated throughout the aviation community. The tragic toll within the Pan Am aircraft was even more staggering, with 317 passengers and 9 cabin crew members losing their lives. Despite the immense devastation, there was a glimmer of hope as 70 individuals from Pan Am's Boeing managed to survive the crash, including the entire cockpit crew. Regrettably, 9 of the survivors ultimately succumbed to their injuries in the aftermath. The cumulative loss of 583 lives in the collision catapulted the Tenerife airport disaster to the grim distinction of being the deadliest in aviation history. The investigation into the Tenerife airport disaster was like a big investigation puzzle. They looked at the black boxes from both planes, which are like special recorders that save important information about flights. This investigation happened in the USA, and the Spanish government organized it. The main pilot of the KLM plane was a 50-year-old man who'd flown for a really long time, around 11,700 hours, which is like flying for a long vacation. He was also the top teacher for pilots at the airline. There were 2 other important people on the KLM plane: the co-pilot, who was 42 years old and had flown for 9,200 hours, and the flight engineer, who was 48 and had flown for over 17,000 hours. The Pan Am plane's main pilot was 56 and had flown for even longer, over 21,000 hours. His co-pilot was 39 and had flown for 10,800 hours, and the flight engineer was 46 with over 15,000 hours of flying. The accident happened because many planes, including the KLM and Pan Am planes, were diverted to Tenerife after another airport had a big problem. There wasn't enough space for all planes, so some were parked on the taxiway near the runway. This caused delays. The KLM plane left first because it needed fuel, and the Pan Am plane had to wait behind it. Then, the fog made it really hard to see, and there was confusion about what the air traffic controller said. The KLM plane started to take off without permission, even though the Pan Am plane was still on the runway. The Pan Am plane tried to tell them they were still there, but it was too late. The KLM plane didn't hear them and didn't stop, and this led to a crash. The investigation showed that the KLM captain, who was like the boss of the KLM plane, made a big mistake by starting takeoff without permission. There were also problems with the way people talked on the radio and how the planes were parked. Those problems all added up to the accident. In the end, the investigation said that the KLM captain's mistake was the main reason for the accident. Other things, like how people talked and how the planes were parked, also made the accident more likely. The investigation also said that everyone needed to learn from the accident to make sure it never happens again. They suggested better ways for people to talk to each other on the radio and for pilots to work together as a team. New rules of engagement were made, but till today, the world will never forget the tragedy that happened on March 27, 1977.